What's good, folks? It's Nightmare Frame here with a new First Descendant video. This video is not a First Descendant build guide, but more of a how to mod your weapons properly guide. In this video, I'll be explaining how mods affect your weapons and the damage output, what to actually look for when you're modding the weapon, and what kind of substats you want to have for your weapon. Because believe it or not, it all depends on the weapon. Now, because everybody gets the Thunder Cage early on, it's easier to relate with the Thunder Cage, and the stats of the Thunder Cage are very good, and it's something that you want to invest in early on. Now, it can be really confusing when you're looking at your weapon stats, because there's three places to look for weapon stats. The first place is when you hover over the weapon and you press details. This is where you see the weapon's stats. You can see the firearm attack, the fire rate, how many rounds it has, the crit rate, crit damage, everything. And you also have your final modded value when you press go to info right here. When you click this, you open up this window where you can see your weapon and all the final stats. You can click each individual weapon that you have equipped and you can see the final values. When I'm talking about final values, is your final modded values. Currently, I don't have any mods on my Thunder Cage, but it still displays the final values when it's affected by substats. You see those yellow numbers? Crit rate, crit damage, those also affect these final values. Usually you're not able to see these in the modding screen. Speaking of the modding screen, this is the third place where you can see your stats. You're wondering, why don't I see anything here? You have two windows. So right there, weapon info and the applied value. Now, before I go into the weapon info, applied values is something that people always get tricked by, especially with weapons that have very low critical hit rates. So let's say you're using something like the Tamer, which has 10% crit rate, and you put in something like Better Insight to give you crit rate. When you look at the applied values, you have 39% crit. You're like, oh my god, my Tamer has 39% crit rate. No. Meaning it will show you all the applied values that are going to be affecting the base stats of your weapon. 39%, 39%. Got it? Perfect. Now, when you click on weapon info, this also shows you the base values of the weapon. Talking about the base values, these are the 100% values of the weapon. And think of the mods that you're going to be applying on your weapon as multipliers, multiplying the base values of your weapon. Because when you look at these mods, they're all in percentage form, and it's very easy to calculate. Don't worry, I will move myself out of the way in a bit, but let's take a look at action reaction here, which is a base damage multiplier. Yes, it does say firearm attack, but consider this as base damage multiplier. Our base damage is right there, firearm attack. This 1100. Now, this mod right here is a 61% base damage increase. When you turn this into a multiplier, it's going to be a 1.61 times base damage multiplier. And when you multiply the base value with 61%, you're going to get 17,790 something. There you go. Math. That's how it works. Base damage multiplier. Now you have another base damage multiplier called rifling reinforcement. This is a 32% increase. These two mods are additive to each other. Notice when I first equipped this mod, it gave me a very high number. Now adding on this rifling reinforcement, the number isn't that high because these are additive to each other, and shoving too much of the same multiplier will lead to diminishing returns. So you always want to spread your multipliers. But in this case, having two of these does help you out a lot because, first of all, the weapon doesn't have high base damage, and the base damage multipliers in this game are not that high. So adding both of these would make sense to give you even more damage. Now we have 21,000. So now that you get it, how these weapons are affecting the base 100% value, let's take a look at some other ways to improve your damage. The first thing I want to tell you is that the DPS number here is quite misleading, because notice how when I put some of these mods, you get a green number showing you that you've increased your DPS. But take a look at something like weak point damage. If I put this, my DPS did not go up. However, compared to putting crit damage, my DPS number goes up. Weak point damage is also a damage increase, a very strong one, but it doesn't register in your DPS number. Neither do elemental damage applications. So this is why anyone showing you, oh, I have big DPS number. No. What matters is the type of mods that you put onto your build to influence your damage output. Every weapon is going to have a basic build, your base damage, crit rate, crit damage, and something else to add on to that. So most of the weapon builds are going to be very similar. Right now, let's take a look at our crits. Crits are very important when it comes to increasing your damage to the next level. The weapon like the Thunder Cage here has a base crit rate of 20%. Now this 20% is a probability of you dealing a critical hit. And when you deal a critical hit, that damage is then multiplied 2 times thanks to your critical hit damage. So if you're not critting, your crit damage is useless. So both of these go together to further boost your damage. So right now with a base of 20%, when we add better insight, this increases our crit rate by 30%, which is just a 7.8% increase to our critical hit rate. However, I also do have a firearm critical hit rate enhancement on my weapon. So yes, these numbers are additive to your mods. Just like how these two are additive to each other, these are additive to your mods as well. So this 13.3% increase is additive to this 39% increase. And this will give me a 30% final increase. So when we go to our weapon info, you can see, oh, right there, 30% crit rate. I hope that makes sense. Now, when we come back to this window, you can see that we have 93% firearm attack increase. It's both of these mods being additive to each other and giving me a 93% increase. Now that you know how critical hit rate is then calculated, let's take a look at critical hit damage. There are going to be 2 critical hit damage mods that we're going to be modding onto this weapon. We have better concentration. This gives us a 74.8% increase, and concentration priority. This gives you 120%, and it does mess with our reload speed. And because critical damage is shown as a multiplier state, and you're going to calculate this the same way. You're going to take that 74.8% added to the 120%, and then that's going to give you a 1.948 times out of 1, turn into a multiplier, and multiply that to your base value of 2 to get a 5.896 times crit damage increase. Just like that. I totally don't have a calculator right next to me because I'm really good at math, trust me. Now, another thing that is not calculated in our DPS is weak point damage multiplier. Now, weak point damage multiplier is a bit interesting because in most games you have a headshot damage multiplier and a weak spot, but this game consolidates all of that into weak point damage. So headshots or any of the boss's little glowy bits, those are weak points. So when you apply a weak point damage increase, you're then multiplying that damage when you hit that weak point. Right now, it's a 1.2 on the Thunder Cage. This will increase it to a 1.6. So when is a good time to actually mod for weak point? Because not all weapons have weak point damage multipliers. So I wouldn't really advise modding weak point onto that. A good place to start is something like the Thunder Cage. It already has a base of 1.2, so might as well add on to that its free damage. So now weak point and crit damage are multiplicative to each other. So that's why you can see crazy damage spikes in your number. Because when you shoot an enemy, you can crit on any spot. But when you hit a weak point, you're going to see your damage spike slightly. But when you hit a weak spot, your damage will spike if you crit. So that is one thing to consider. Your critting and weak point is a massive boost to your damage. Now, moving on to something that is overlooked and underestimated in a lot of build videos when it comes to weapon modding, and that is elemental damage. Elemental damage is very, very strong. So you have 4 elements in this game: chill, electric, toxin, and fire. Now, all of these will scale with a percentage of your firearm attack. So 30%, 30%, 30%, you get it. But elemental damage is displayed a bit differently and is calculated differently. When you shoot an enemy, you're going to have a separate instance of damage applied to the enemy. So your main damage and then another damage, and that is your elemental damage. So currently I have no elemental damage modded onto my weapon. If I shoot, you can see I'm hitting weak point, that's 20k. And when I crit, my damage is then further increased because weak point critting. So these are my damage instances with non-elemental modding. Take a look at when I put an elemental damage mod onto my build. So if I put something like chill over here, this will give me a chill attack equal to 30% of my firearm attack. And when I shoot this target, you see right there, weak point and elemental damage. 2 instances of damage. And if I do crit, I have my elemental damage also critting. You can see right there. Now here's another thing. Elemental damage is affected by your crits and your base damage, but unfortunately, it is not affected by weak point damage. But still, I just further boosted my damage right now by adding an element. I'm dealing way more damage than I would if I were to just run a non-elemental build. Now, all of these elements do different things. Starting off with chill, as you just saw right there, chill applies a status effect that will stun and halt enemies. Not really effective on bosses, but it's still good damage to have. However, electricity, toxin, and heat will all apply a damage over time that will tick with 0.5 second damage intervals. Electric and fire do not stack, and you can only have 1 instance of damage. However, when it comes to toxin does stack. So I think toxin could be really powerful in a lot of situations. So if I were to shoot right now and have it proc, you'll see the toxin element right there. Oh, not reloading at the worst time. Whenever you want to show something, it doesn't work the way you want it to show. Right there, you saw that it had a 2. It had a 2. Trust me, it does stack. It does stack. But here's another thing I'll talk about when it comes to status effect triggering. We'll get to that in a bit. But anyway, as I was saying, toxin does stack. Heat and electric do not stack, but they all deal damage over time, which is always good to have because that's even more damage application. Let's say right now I'm modded for electricity and we shoot the enemy. We're dealing that electrical elemental damage right there. And you can see it's dealing damage over time. And unfortunately, damage over time does not crit. However, it is affected by crit. Now, what does this mean? So when you land a critical hit and procs an element and the elemental status effect, that elemental status effect that crits and applies a damage over time is affected by that crit damage. So then you'll see your elemental damage tick go for a lot higher. Simple as that. Now let's talk about a stat that can confuse some people, and that is attribute status effect trigger rate. Now if you were to think of this logically, if you have a fast firing weapon, you should be applying your status effects more frequently, right? Well, you're wrong. Your status effect trigger is affected by your fire rate. Not your modded fire rate, but your base fire rate. So the faster your weapon fires, the lower the status chance you're going to have.
Why? That physically makes no sense.
For example, right now the Thunder Cage has 4%. If you go to something like the Python, this has a 3%. That's even lower. And this is not a crit weapon. You would think, hey, since this is not a crit weapon, we would have higher status effect, right? No, it's lower. And then we go to something like the Afterglow. This is a sniper. When we take a look at the effect status trigger rate, it's higher at 33%. So yeah, this is one thing that confuses a few people. If your weapon fires slower, you're likely to proc status effects more frequently. So if I were to use my sniper right now, I had to go grab some ammo. We'll have 33% chance of triggering a status effect right there. Oh, there, you see the toxin stacks. Your snipers or anything slow firing will have a higher chance of triggering a status effect. Elemental damage is heavily overlooked in favor of some of these mods, like Sharp Precision Shot. This does reduce your fire rate, but it does increase your firearm attack, and increases with fire rate the more you fire. Some of these mods, like Firing Fiesta and Sharp Precision Shot, I did test these out, and I found that my damage wasn't as high when compared to modding for elemental damage. So elemental damage will always trump over these mods, especially on something like the Thunder Cage, where Firing Fiesta is only visible every 15 seconds. And when you blow your load after those 15 seconds, it's just like, well, you could have added way more damage when you apply elemental damage onto the build. Now here's another thing that's confusing. Modded elemental damage and substat elemental damage. These are two different things. Now, substat elemental damage, let's go over to something that has that. Right now, I have a blue fire attack on this weapon that I'm still leveling, and it is unmodded. So you can see, doesn't matter what I shoot, I will still proc an element. And this is a separate instance of damage. It will trigger the status effect and burn the enemy. that is fire. When you have an elemental damage mod on your weapon, you'll trigger that damage type. However, if the enemy is resistant to that, you will deal less. If you have any elemental enchantment on your weapon, this will be dealt as a separate instance of damage similar to modded elements, and you can have two elements, your modded element and your bonus element. So let's say I add electricity to this. Now if I shoot, I get electricity and heat. That's pretty huge, actually. If you have elemental damage on your weapon and as an enhancement, it's actually giga damage. Really giga damage. Unfortunately, you can only have one instance of damage over time, and that damage over time will always take priority on your modded element and not your bonus elemental damage on the substats. So you will deal additional instances of damage. You get right there, fire and electric, which is huge, but your electricity will always take priority. Now the downside is you cannot have more than one elemental damage mod on your weapon. If you have electric, you got to stick to electric. So if you want toxin, boom, stick with that toxin. Right now if I shoot, I have toxin and electric. This is actually pretty huge. So that's the one thing you're going to have to compromise. Pick an element that you want to put on your weapon, and if you want a bonus element, make sure it's something else. Going for a bonus element on a weapon is usually 50-50, whether you have enough damage and you want an additional proc, or whether you don't know what else to put on the weapon, and elemental damage is always good. Now that we're here, let's talk about substats. On my Thunder Cage, I went with crit rate, crit damage, magazine, and weak point. Now, I don't necessarily need to have magazine on there. It does give me a couple of more bullets, but I could have gone with something else. I could have gone with either bonus element, damage to colossi, if I'm going to be using this for bossing. That's also very good to have, but I'm using this as an all-rounder weapon, so I don't really need damage to colossi. And I could have gone for firearm attack. That firearm attack increase is so low that it's not worth it, and it's going to be additive to my modded firearm attack. So not really worth it. A better increase right there would have been either an elemental damage increase, bonus damage to colossi, or if I'm using this against a certain faction, that could also be useful. But I'm not going to do that, and to be honest, not really worth doing that. Unless you're going to be using for the future hard dungeons, then maybe faction damage will be really strong. Otherwise, rounds per magazine, that felt nice to me. I could have added more elements to this. That would have increased my DPS even further. To be honest, I will test that out just to see how good it will be. And of course, bonus damage to colossi. But that crit rate, crit damage, and weak point damage, always good to have if your weapon has crit stats and weak point stats. It's best to add on to that. So here's some other mods that actually boost your DPS. Adding magazine. This right there. So right there, this is a 49% to my bullets. 38 plus that bonus magazine enhancement, we get 41. We have a longer time to shoot, which further boosts my damage. Oh yeah, very basic. Another thing to further boost our damage overall is fire rate. Always gonna have fire rate, so we blow our load faster. Look at that. That's way more damage in a short period. So if you're having problems with reload speed, or if you're having problems with whatever, and you want to add in more crit damage, you want to add more crit rate, you want to add a unique mod like Firing Fiesta, Sharp Precision Shot, this slot is usually what you're going to do. However, for me, I thought, you know, it's better to have more magazine. Added 8 more bullets to my gun, but this also gives me some crit damage. Right now, if you have a look, I have 46 magazine and 6 times critical hit damage. So when I crit, I'm dealing 6 times my damage. And when I fully reload, I have 49 bullets in the magazine. So that's a lot of damage that you're going to be dealing in a short period. So as you can see, this is quite similar to what I have over here. I just went over my Thunder Cage build, and this is what I found comfortable and to deal the most damage rather than running Sharp Precision Shots or Firing Fiesta. Yes, I even use this particular build itself against the Executioner, who has a high resistance to electricity. Just adding more damage to your shots is better DPS overall. And you can see my final number there of DPS is 500,000, even though this is not taken into account or elemental damage is not taken into account. So yeah, this is how you'd consider modding certain weapons. So this is your general rounds weapon. You do have impact round weapons, which are the green ammo. Now I went slightly different with this one because, well, I didn't really finish the catalyzation process. I'm considering re-rolling that firearm attack to an element and of course getting that colossi damage to gold just to see how strong this will be, because then I don't have to mod for an element here and keep up with my damage. You can see I have my base damage, crit rate. We're at 53% crit rate here. Of course, that is additive to the crit rate here. I have reload focus. This gives me reload speed. I have crit damage, fire rate, and crit damage. Always gotta love crit damage. We're multiplying our damage as much as possible. A weak point expansion. On weak point hits, we get 140% multiplier to our weak point. This has a 5-second cooldown. So when this weapon crits and you hit a weak point, the damage. So usually when you go to boss fights and all that, you want to have a general rounds weapon, a different ammo type weapon, and a heavy. So it's always best to expand your arsenal. I like to have my main damaging weapon, a heavy hitting weapon, and a utility weapon that also can deal damage. Now, in this case, for example, my main damaging weapon is the Thunder Cage. This is for the consistent DPS. My utility weapon is the Nazastra because it debuffs the enemy with its unique ability right there, Defense Shred by 30%. Always good to have. This is nice for you and your teammates if you're in a fight. And finally, the big heavy weapon, which I still need to invest more into. This is when, let's say you're fighting a boss that's teleporting around like a lunatic, Dead Bride, and she does those little things on her hands. You can snipe those off. Or if a boss is running away too far from you and it has a weak spot right there exposed, boom, you hit it. And of course, when you want to keep your distance just a little bit, always good to have different ammo types ready for you in a fight. So yeah, folks, that has been it for me. I do have enjoyed and learned something from this video. And if you did, please feel free to leave a like, share, and
subscribe.
For more First Descendant content streams and so much more, do refer to the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, a peace. Bye-bye now.